On July 11th, 1943, at 6:47 in the morning, Senior Sergeant Alexei Gromov violated a direct order from command. He loaded into his 76mm divisional ZIS-3 gun a shell that could explode right in the barrel and kill the entire crew. Over the next 20 minutes, his gun destroyed 14 German tanks. Command wanted to put him on trial. The military prosecutor was already preparing the indictment, but when the smoke cleared over the field near Prokhorovka and the German attack choked in the metallic mess of burned panzers, instead of execution, a reward awaited him. This is a story about how one artilleryman understood what designers in Moscow laboratories did not understand. About how a man standing at the gun saw a solution where engineers saw only danger, and about how a crime against regulations turned into a tactic that saved hundreds of Soviet lives. But before telling about that day near Prokhorovka, one needs to understand who this man was and what chain of events led him to a decision that could have cost him his life or brought him glory. Alexei Pavlovich Gromov was 26 years old. He was born in 1917 in the settlement of Barabinsk in Novosibirsk Oblast, in the family of a track walker on the Trans-Siberian Railway. His father taught him the main rule of the railroad. Instructions can only be broken when following them will lead to catastrophe. He remembered this rule for his entire life. Before the war, Gromov worked as a foreman at the Barabinsk locomotive repair plant. He repaired locomotives, knew metal by touch and by sound, could detect a crack in a frame by the sound of a hammer strike, could understand whether a part would withstand the load simply by holding it in his hands. These skills, as it turned out later, served him in the war better than any military training. He was drafted into the Red Army in October of '41. After 3 months of training at the Omsk Artillery School, he received the rank of junior sergeant and was sent to the Western Front as a gunner of a 76mm divisional ZIS-3 gun. By July of '43, he had already risen to senior sergeant and held the position of gun crew commander as part of the 708th Anti-Tank Artillery Regiment. Over these 2 years, Gromov went through battles near Moscow, Rzhev, and Kharkov. His gun knocked out 11 enemy tanks and armored personnel carriers. Twice he was wounded by shrapnel and a bullet. 3 times his crewmates perished. He learned to sleep under artillery fire, eat frozen porridge, and shoot when his hands trembled from cold or fear. But most importantly, he learned to think under fire. Outwardly, Gromov stood out in no way among thousands of other artillerymen of the Red Army. Average height, lean, with a weathered, tanned face and gray eyes that squinted even in cloudy weather. The habit of peering at the horizon, searching for enemy tanks. On his left hand, a scar from shrapnel received near Rzhev. On his right, a tattoo. Barabinsk, a memory of pre-war youth. His battery comrades knew him as a man of few words, but reliable. He never raised his voice, even in the fiercest battle. His commands sounded even and clear, as if he were reading a textbook on artillery. But behind this calm lay keen observation, which led him to a discovery that changed anti-tank combat tactics. One character trait distinguished Gromov from the rest. He took nothing on faith. Every order, every instruction, every rule he tested in practice. If something worked, he followed it unquestioningly. If something did not work, he looked for another way. It was precisely this trait that made him both a violator of regulations and a savior of hundreds of lives. By the summer of 1943, Soviet divisional artillery faced a crisis that was not written about in newspapers. German tanks had become invulnerable. The standard armor-piercing shell, BR-350A, fired from a ZIS-3, penetrated 60 millimeters of armor from a distance of 500 meters. This was enough to defeat old German panzers of the 3rd and 4th series. But with the appearance of tigers and panthers, the situation changed catastrophically. The frontal armor of the tiger was 100 millimeters, the panther 80 millimeters at a sharp angle, which made it practically impenetrable. Even modernized panzers of the 4th series now carried additional screens, increasing the effective armor thickness to 70 to 80 millimeters. The ZIS-3 shell bounced off this armor like peas off a wall. Gromov first encountered this problem on March 5, 43, near Kharkov. His battery occupied positions on the outskirts of the village of Taranovka, covering the withdrawal of rifle units. At 8:30 in the morning, tanks appeared on the horizon. First, he saw a silhouette he had never encountered before. The machine was enormous, taller than ordinary panzers, with a long gun and a massive angular turret. It was a tiger. Its gun opened fire from a distance of 800 meters. The first shell struck the frontal armor of the tank. Gromov clearly saw the flash of impact, but the tiger continued moving as if it had been pricked with a pin. Second shell, third, fourth. Each time a hit, each time no result. The tiger stopped at a distance of 600 meters and fired. The 88 millimeter shell passed 2 meters from Gromov's gun and destroyed the gun of the neighboring crew. The crew commander, Senior Sergeant Fyodor Kuznetsov from Ryazan, died instantly. With him died the gunner and the loader. Gromov fired 3 more shells. Not one penetrated the tiger's armor. He was saved only by the fact that the German tank turned and left. Apparently, it ran out of shells or fuel. But Gromov understood. His gun was no longer capable of fighting German tanks. In the following week, he saw how this problem killed his comrades. On March 12th, near Kharkov, the crew of Lieutenant Victor Severin perished. Severin was a battery commander, an experienced officer who had been fighting since '41. His gun expended the entire ammunition load on advancing panthers, destroying not a single one. German tanks crushed all 4 guns of the battery along with their crews. On March 19th, gunner Semyon Prokhorov died. He was from Gromov's crew. A young fellow of 19 years, from Voronezh. Prokhorov fired at a tiger head-on, achieving not a single penetration. When the tank approached 200 meters, Prokhorov tried to run. He was cut down by a machine gunner from the tank's turret. On March 23rd, the commander of the neighboring crew, Sergeant Major Ivan Timofeyev, died. Timofeyev had served in the army for 9 years, even before the war. He knew every paragraph of the regulations, every line of the firing instructions, and he died doing everything by the rules. His shells simply did not penetrate the armor. By the end of March 43, Gromov lost count of the dead. His regiment changed personnel 3 times in 4 months of fighting. Each new gunner, each new loader was a person he knew for a week or 2 before he died or received serious wounds. Artillerymen called it a meat grinder. They were sent to positions. They expended the entire ammunition load without causing significant damage to the enemy. And then they were crushed or shot by German tanks. Regiment losses amounted to up to 30% of personnel per month. The problem was in physics. An armor-piercing shell works through kinetic energy. The higher the shell's velocity upon meeting armor, the deeper it penetrates. But the shell's velocity drops with distance due to air resistance. At a distance of a kilometer, the ZIS-3 shell lost almost half its energy. In addition, the angle of armor inclination played a critical role. The Panther had frontal armor inclined at an angle of 55 degrees. At such an inclination, the effective armor thickness doubled. An 80mm plate worked like a 160mm one. Command knew about the problem. Designers worked on solutions. Subcaliber shells with tungsten cores were created, which penetrated more armor at close distances. But tungsten was a scarce material, and subcaliber shells were issued literally by the piece, 3 or 4 per gun. And there were shaped charge shells. Gromov first heard about them in April '43, when the regiment stood for reformation in the rear. The political officer told about a new wonder weapon, shells that burn through armor of any thickness. Artillerymen listened with distrust. They had heard many promises. Nothing promised worked against Tigers. But then Gromov saw shaped charge shells with his own eyes. Crates marked BP-350M were delivered to the regiment in early May. The shells looked different from ordinary armor-piercing ones. The head was blunt, with a characteristic recess covered by a thin cap. Along with the shells came instructions, and these instructions contained words that made Gromov stop. Attention! The use of shaped charge shells BP-350M in divisional ZIS-3 and USV guns is prohibited due to the danger of premature detonation of the fuse and explosion of the shell in the gun barrel. Shaped charge shells were permitted for use only in regimental guns of the 1927 model and new regimental guns of the '43 model. These guns had a shorter barrel and lower initial shell velocity. The shaped charge shell fuse, developed in haste, could not withstand the overloads when fired from long-barreled divisional guns. Gromov reread the instructions several times. He understood the main thing. There exists a shell capable of penetrating any armor, but he has no right to use it because this shell could explode in the barrel of his gun. The logic of the prohibition was understandable. An explosion in the barrel would destroy the gun and kill the crew. Better to have a working gun with weak shells than a dead crew with powerful ones. But the logic of war was different. A working gun with weak shells could not stop German tanks. Crews died one way or another, under tracks, from shells, from machine guns. The difference was only whether they managed before death to inflict damage on the enemy. In May, Gromov began to think. He remembered his work at the locomotive repair plant. He remembered how he tested parts for strength. He remembered how he determined whether metal would withstand the load. The shaped charge shell fuse triggered from overload during firing. The higher the initial shell velocity, the greater the overload. Regimental guns had an initial velocity of about 300 meters per second. The ZIS-3 about 680. But what if the charge were reduced? What if one fired with a reduced charge, lowering the initial velocity? Gromov began studying artillery tables. He discovered that a standard reduced charge for the ZIS-3 actually existed. It was used when firing indirect fire at short distances. The initial shell velocity with a reduced charge dropped to 400 to 450 meters per second. This was closer to the parameters of regimental guns, possibly close enough. But the question remained, would the shaped charge shell work at such velocity? After all, the armor penetration of ordinary shells directly depended on velocity. And here Gromov remembered what the political officer had said. Shaped charge shells work differently. They penetrate armor not through velocity, but through a directed explosion. They do not need high impact velocity. They only need to hit. This meant that theoretically, a shaped charge shell fired from a ZIS-3 with a reduced charge should retain its armor penetration. At the same time, the reduced overload during firing would decrease the risk of premature fuse detonation. The theory was beautiful, but Gromov knew the price of theories. In war, only practice works. In June '43, when the regiment stood in reserve near Kursk, Gromov decided to test his theory. Not in battle. That would be suicide. But a test could be conducted. He chose a moment when the battery was training at practice firing. Targets were the hulks of knocked-out German tanks, of which there were enough by that time on the Kursk fields. Gromov picked up a shaped charge shell, BP-350M, removed from another gun. Those that had been issued to regimental artillery, but not used due to loss of crews. He loaded the round with a reduced charge, aimed the gun at the hulk of a Panzer IV from a distance of 400 meters, and fired. The shell did not explode in the barrel. It hit the tank's turret and passed through the armor like a red-hot needle through butter. When Gromov approached the target, he saw a characteristic hole, small, with melted edges. Inside the tank, everything was torn apart by fragments and a stream of molten metal. One shot, one destroyed tank. Gromov returned to the gun and made 3 more shots. All 3 shells left the barrel without incident. All 3 penetrated the armor of the targets. The theory worked, but it was illegal. He violated a direct prohibition from command. He used shells not for their intended purpose. He put himself and his crew at risk. Gromov told no one about his experiment. He simply remembered the results and began waiting for the moment when this knowledge would be useful. That moment came on July 11th, 43, near Prokhorovka. The night of the 10th to the 11th of July, Gromov spent without sleep. His crew occupied a position on height 232.5, 3 kilometers southwest of Prokhorovka station. Ahead in the darkness, the rumble of engines could be heard. German tanks were preparing for the morning offensive. The battery received an ammunition load, 40 high-explosive fragmentation shells, 12 armor-piercing, and 4 sub-caliber per gun. Shaped charge shells, as usual, were not available. They were issued only to regimental artillery. But Gromov knew where to get shaped charge shells. 200 meters from his position, by a destroyed dugout, lay the remains of a 76mm regimental gun of the 1927 model. Its crew had died the day before during a German attack. The gun was mangled by a direct hit, but the shells survived. At 3 o'clock in the morning, when his crewmates slept half awake in the trench, Gromov crawled out of cover and crept toward the destroyed gun. German flares periodically flashed over the field, and each time he froze, pressing himself into the ground. At the gun, he found what he was looking for. 3 crates of shells. 2 contained high-explosive fragmentation shells. The third, shaped charge BP-350M. 24 pieces. Gromov dragged the crate with shaped charge shells to his position. It took almost an hour. The crate weighed more than 60 kilograms, and it had to be dragged crawling under the fire of flares. By 4 in the morning, the shells were hidden in a niche dug behind the gun. No one in the crew knew about them. Gromov sat by the gun and began waiting for dawn. Calculations spun in his head. Reduced charge lowers initial velocity to 450 meters per second. This reduces effective direct fire range to approximately 400 meters. Shaped charge shell penetrates 70 to 75 millimeters of armor regardless of distance. Tiger frontal armor 100 millimeters will not penetrate. Side armor 80 millimeters on the edge. But the Tiger's turret had sides 82 millimeters thick, and the rear only 80. With a lucky hit at an angle, a Panther, front of hull 80 millimeters at an angle of 55 degrees will not penetrate. But the side of the hull 40 millimeters, turret from the side 45, rear 40. Panzer IV, front 80 millimeters with screens, will not penetrate head-on, but side 30 millimeters, turret 50. Gromov understood the main thing. Shaped charge shells did not solve the problem completely. They could not penetrate a Tiger or Panther head-on, but they could destroy these tanks when hitting the side or rear. And for this, it was necessary to let them come close and strike from the flank. 400 meters. This was the distance at which a German tank could destroy his gun with one shot. This was a distance at which one could not miss. This was a suicide distance. but this was the only distance at which his gun could kill a tiger. 5 o'clock in the morning, Gromov woke his crew. Gunner Grigory Sidorenko, loader Pavel Morozov, ammunition carrier Ivan Chernik. All three looked at him with tired eyes. Gromov did not explain everything to them. He said only, "Today we will fire in a new way. When I say special, load a shell from that crate." He pointed to the niche behind the gun. "And remember, fire only at the side, only when the tank turns, never at the front." Sidorenko, an experienced gunner, understood immediately. "Cumulative, but they are forbidden." "I know," answered Gromov. "Do what I say." Morozov and Chernik exchanged glances but remained silent. At the front, they had learned not to ask unnecessary questions. At 6 o'clock in the morning, artillery preparation began. The earth shook from explosions. German shells plowed through Soviet positions. Soviet shells answered in kind. At 6:30, tanks appeared on the horizon. The first wave advanced in a wedge formation. 3 Tigers in front, behind them 12.5 Panzer IVs and self-propelled guns. Gromov counted no fewer than 30 vehicles on a section several kilometers wide. The battery opened fire from a distance of 1,200 meters. Armor-piercing shells flew toward the German tanks, striking sparks on impact. Not a single penetration, not a single stopped tank. The Tigers answered rarely, but accurately. The very first salvo destroyed the gun to the right of Gromov's position. The crew of Senior Sergeant Petrov perished completely. A direct hit on the gun shield. Gromov continued firing armor-piercing shells. He was waiting for the moment. The tanks approached. 1,000 meters. 800. 700. Armor-piercing shells still bounced off the frontal armor of the Tigers. Battery Commander Lieutenant Vasiliev shouted into the radio demanding reinforcements. There were no reinforcements. The entire defense line was under attack. 600 meters. The Tiger at the head of the column stopped and turned its turret. Gromov understood. It would fire now. He threw himself to the ground fractions of a second before the 88mm shell struck the parapet 3 meters from the gun. Earth, stones, fragments. Gunner Sidorenko screamed. He was hit in the shoulder, but he remained in action. "Don't stop!" shouted Gromov. "Continue firing!" 500 meters. 450. Gromov counted seconds. The Tigers were heading straight for his position, and their frontal armor was impenetrable. But to the left, farther left, where the slope of the height formed a small hollow, he saw what he was looking for. One of the Panzer IVs deviated from its course, skirting a crater from a large shell. For a second, its side was turned toward Gromov's gun. "Quote 7, shouted Gromov. Morozov froze for a moment, then rushed to the niche behind the gun. 1 second. He returned with a cumulative shell. Another second. The shell in the breech. Gromov added, quote 8. Sidorenko understood. His fingers found the right cartridge in the tray. Regimental rounds with reduced charge, which Gromov had prepared in advance. The breech closed. Sidorenko aimed the gun. Gromov saw the Panzer in the sight, a black silhouette against the gray sky, turned sideways. 400 meters. The gun jerked. The shell flew from the barrel. Gromov held his breath. If the fuse worked incorrectly, if the theory proved wrong, the shell hit the side of the Panzer just below the turret. A flash. The tank jerked and froze. Smoke poured from the open hatches. Morozov shouted something incoherent. Chernik cursed. Sidorenko silently grasped the aiming mechanism. Gromov shouted again. The next tank, another Panzer, was trying to bypass its burning comrade. It also turned its side. Shot. Hit. Smoke.
The third tank. This one was smarter, tried to turn back, but its side was open long enough. Shot, hit, ammunition explosion. The Panzer's turret flew into the air, spinning like a tossed coin. 4 minutes. 3 tanks. The German Tigers noticed what was happening. The lead one turned its turret toward Gromov. The 88mm gun looked him straight in the face. "Take cover!" shouted Gromov. The crew threw themselves into the trench.
The Tiger's shell struck the gun shield. The ZIS-3 overturned. A wheel flew off to the side. Gromov looked out from the trench. The gun was damaged, but not destroyed. The barrel intact, the breech intact. The sight, there was no sight. It had been torn off by the impact. They would have to fire blind, along the barrel. Shouted Gromov. 4 men heaved at the overturned gun. It weighed 100 kilograms, but adrenaline makes people stronger. The gun stood on its carriage, one wheel broken. No matter. The main thing, the barrel pointed in the right direction. The Tiger was advancing, 350 meters. Its turret was still turned toward Gromov. Morozov threw a shell into the breech. Chadnik shoved in a cartridge with reduced charge. Gromov pressed against the barrel, trying to aim the gun by eye. The Tiger was coming straight on, its frontal armor impenetrable, but the turret was turned to the right, and its left side was open. 300 meters. 320 meters. Effective thickness of the turret side about 60 millimeters. Gromov pressed the trigger. The shell struck the base of the Tiger's turret. Gromov saw the characteristic flash of the cumulative charge, bright, white, unlike an ordinary explosion. The Tiger's turret jerked and froze. Tankers began climbing out of the hatches. A machine gunner from a neighboring foxhole cut them down. Gromov did not look at them. He was searching for the next target. A Panther on the right. It turned, trying to cover the burning Tiger. Its side was open for 3 seconds. Shot. Hit in the engine compartment. The Panther caught fire. Another Panzer IV. Its commander understood what was happening and tried to reverse, but backward movement is always slow. The side opened. Shot. Hit. The tank stopped. 6 minutes from the start of the battle. 6 destroyed tanks. The German attack began to falter. The tanks, having lost their lead Tiger, lost coordination. Some continued moving forward, others stopped, still others tried to turn and retreat. Gromov gave them no respite. Each time a German tank showed its side, a shot. Each shot, a hit. Each hit, destruction. At 6:52, 20 minutes after the start of the battle, the remaining German tanks turned and began to withdraw. Gromov fired the last cumulative shell after a retreating Panzer IV. Hit in the rear, the tank caught fire. 14 destroyed tanks, 20 cumulative shells expended, 6 misses. Firing without a sight made itself known. Gromov sank to the ground beside his gun. His hands trembled, his ears rang from the roar of shots. Sidorenko sat by the breech, holding his wounded shoulder. Blood seeped through his fingers. He said hoarsely. He did not finish, but Gromov understood. The silence after battle did not last long. 15 minutes later, the regimental commander, Lieutenant Colonel Nikolai Stepanovich Ermakov, arrived at the battery position. His willies bounced between craters and stopped at Gromov's damaged gun. Ermakov was a career officer who had served in artillery since 1931. He had been through the Finnish War, the defense of Moscow, Stalingrad. His face, lined with wrinkles and scars, expressed no emotion as he surveyed the battlefield. 14 burning and smoking German tanks, 1 knocked-out Tiger. The first Tiger destroyed on this sector of the front by divisional artillery.
5 Panthers and Panzer IVs, the rest medium tanks and self-propelled guns. Ermakov approached Gromov. The senior sergeant tried to stand and salute, but the lieutenant colonel stopped him with a gesture. "Sit. Are you wounded?" "No, comrade lieutenant colonel. Light concussion." Ermakov looked at the gun, the broken sight, the broken wheel, the bent shield, and the empty crate of shells nearby. A crate marked BP 350M. The lieutenant colonel squatted and picked up an empty cartridge case, examined it, then looked at Gromov. "Cumulative," he said.
This was not a question. "Yes, comrade lieutenant colonel." "From a divisional gun?"
"Yes."
Ermakov was silent for a long time. Gromov felt cold sweat running down his back. He knew he had violated an order. He knew that a tribunal was prescribed for this. "Where did you get the shells?" Ermakov finally asked. "From a destroyed regimental gun, comrade lieutenant colonel. The crew perished yesterday. The shells remained." "Why did you fire? You knew about the prohibition?" Gromov looked at the burning German tanks. "Armor-piercing shells did not penetrate, comrade lieutenant colonel. The Tigers were coming straight at us. We would have perished without inflicting damage on the enemy." Ermakov stood. He looked for a long time at the battlefield, at the smoking tank wrecks, at the bodies of German tankers scattered around the machines. "You knew the shell could explode in the barrel?" "I knew, comrade lieutenant colonel. But I conducted a test earlier. Reduced charge, lowering the overload during firing. The fuse withstands it." Ermakov turned sharply to him. "A test? When?" "In June, comrade lieutenant colonel. At training firing. 4 shots, all successful." The lieutenant colonel fell silent again. Gromov saw different feelings struggling on his face. Anger at the violation of orders, surprise at the result, and something else that Gromov did not immediately recognize. Then he understood. Hope. "Stand up, senior sergeant," said Ermakov. Gromov stood, swaying. The concussion still made itself known. "You understand that I must arrest you?" asked the lieutenant colonel. "Violation of a direct command order, use of prohibited ammunition, endangering personnel." "I understand, comrade lieutenant colonel. The military prosecutor will be delighted. The case is simple, the evidence is plain." Gromov was silent. He knew this was true. Ermakov looked at him with a long gaze, then turned to his adjutant, who stood by the Willies. "Lieutenant Kozlov," he said, "record in the combat operations log. The battery of Senior Lieutenant Vasiliev destroyed 14 enemy tanks, including 1 Tiger heavy tank. Fire was conducted with standard ammunition at direct fire range." The adjutant opened his mouth, but Ermakov stopped him with a look. "Standard ammunition," he repeated. "Is that clear?" "Yes, comrade lieutenant colonel." Ermakov turned to Gromov. "Senior sergeant, I heard nothing about cumulative shells. I saw only the result of the battle. The result of the battle is 14 destroyed tanks. Is that clear?" Gromov felt the tension slowly releasing him. "Yes, comrade lieutenant colonel." "Good." Ermakov took a notebook and pencil from his pocket. "Now tell me in detail what charge you used, at what distance, at what angle the shells hit." The next hour, Gromov spent explaining to the lieutenant colonel the details of his method. Ermakov wrote down everything: technical parameters, tactical techniques, the results of each shot. By noon on the 11th of July, information about the battle at height 232.5 reached division headquarters. By evening, Army headquarters. The next day, the 12th of July, when the largest tank battle of the war unfolded near Prokhorovka, The command already knew about Gromov's method, but knowing and applying are different things. On the 12th of July, the day of the main battle near Prokhorovka, Gromov received a new gun to replace the damaged one. His crew was replenished. In place of the wounded Sidorenko, they sent a new gunner, a young corporal from a training regiment. The battery took positions on the southern flank of the Soviet counterstrike. At 8:30 in the morning, Soviet tanks went on the attack, and anti-tank artillery was to operate with them, including Gromov's regiment. Before the start of the battle, the battery commander, Senior Lieutenant Vasilyev, drove up to Gromov's position. His face was gray from lack of sleep and tension. He said, he handed Gromov a crumpled envelope. Inside was a note written by hand. Attached to the note was a requisition for receiving from the warehouse 2 crates of cumulative shells, BP 350M. Gromov looked at Vasilyev. Vasilyev nodded. He paused. Vasilyev looked for a long time at the horizon, where columns of smoke from burning tanks were already rising. He said finally. He turned and walked to his gun. Gromov opened the crates of cumulative shells, 48 pieces, enough to destroy 100 tanks if every shot hit its target. The battle of the 12th of July was completely unlike the battle of the previous day. Yesterday, Gromov defended, waited for the enemy to approach firing distance. Today, he was advancing together with Soviet tanks. This created new problems. In an attack, the gun constantly moves. One must quickly take position, fire several shots, and move again before the enemy ranges in. There is no time for careful aiming. But there were also advantages. In an attack, German tanks are forced to maneuver, showing their sides and rears, exactly what is needed for cumulative shells. The first battle of the day began at 9 o'clock in the morning. Soviet T-34s collided with German Tigers from the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler Division in the area of the October State Farm. Gromov with his crew followed a tank company, ready to support it with fire. The picture was terrible. Tigers shot up the 34s from a distance of 1.5 kilometers. Soviet tanks burned one after another, not managing to close to the effective firing range of their 76mm guns, but some 34s broke through. They raced at maximum speed, weaving between craters and burning machines, trying to reduce the distance to the Tigers. Gromov saw one T-34 come around the side of a German heavy tank. The Soviet tanker fired point-blank from a distance of less than 100 meters. The shell hit the Tiger's side and bounced off. The armor held. The Tiger turned its turret and destroyed the 34 with one shot. Gromov understood. Even at such a distance, the armor-piercing shell of a T-34 does not penetrate a Tiger in the side. The 82mm side armor was too thick, but his cumulative shell would penetrate. He shouted to the crew. The crew deployed the gun behind the wreck of a knocked-out Panzer. The cover was unreliable. The Germans could notice them at any moment. But Gromov needed only a minute. The Tiger that had destroyed the 34 was turning, seeking a new target. Its side was open. The shell flew into the breach. Reduced charge, aiming along the barrel. The side was again damaged during the crossing over a crater. 400 meters. Gromov pressed the trigger. Hit in the side of the Tiger's turret just below the commander's cupola. Flash of the cumulative charge. The tank froze. The crew grabbed the gun and dragged it to the next cover. Behind them, the Tiger began to burn. The cumulative jet ignited the ammunition. The second Tiger noticed them. Its turret was turning. The long barrel of the 88mm gun was searching for a target. Gromov had 10 seconds. High explosive. The loader worked faster than ever before. Shell, charge, breach. Fire. Both guns fired almost simultaneously.
The Tiger shell passed over the heads of Gromov's crew, shearing off the top of the parapet. Gromov's shell hit the side of the German tank. But this time something went wrong. Instead of a flash and a halt, the Tiger continued moving.
The shell had hit the side screen, additional armor that the Germans hung on tanks for protection against shape-charge ammunition. The screen absorbed the energy of the shape-charge jet. The main armor remained intact. "Damn it," Gromov cursed. High explosive at the rear, hit the rear. The Tiger was turning for a second shot, but as it turned, it exposed its rear, the only place where there was no screen. "Fire!" The shell hit precisely in the rear part of the turret. This time the shaped charge jet passed through the armor. The Tiger jerked and stopped. Black smoke poured from the hatches. 2 Tigers in 3 minutes. But Gromov understood an important lesson. Screens change everything. You need to hit only those places where there are no screens. The rear, the back of the turret, sometimes the upper part of the hull. By noon, Vasiliev's battery had destroyed 11 tanks, 8 of them by Gromov's crew. Other crews also tried to use shape-charge shells, but without Gromov's experience, the results were worse. 2 guns were lost when German tanks spotted them before they could fire, but the main thing was done. Rumors about Gromov's methods spread across the front at the speed of a field telephone. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, an officer from Army headquarters arrived at the battery's position, a major with artilleryman's insignia. He introduced himself as Dmitry Alexandrovich Sokolov, senior weapons officer of the artillery command of the 5th Guards Army. He said to Gromov, "Yes, sir, Comrade Major. And you used shaped charge shells from a divisional gun?" Gromov looked at the battery commander. Vasiliev nodded. "You can speak." "Yes, sir, Comrade Major, with a reduced charge." Sokolov took out a notebook. "Tell me in detail, what exact charge, what muzzle velocity, at what distance does it work reliably?" For the next hour, Gromov repeated what he had already told Colonel Ermakov. But Major Sokolov asked different questions, more technical, deeper. He was interested in the physics of the process, the behavior of the shell in flight, the nature of armor penetration. "Quote 64, said the Major. "Were there any cases of premature detonation of the fuse?" "No, sir, Comrade Major." "And today and yesterday, how many shots in total?" Gromov calculated in his mind. 68 shots, Comrade Major, all without incidents." 68, Sokolov repeated. "That's already statistics." He closed the notebook. "Senior Sergeant, do you understand that your method contradicts official instructions?" "Yes, sir, Comrade Major." "And do you understand that formally you should be put before a tribunal?" "I understand, Comrade Major." Sokolov looked at the burning German tanks on the battlefield. "And do you understand that if your method is officially authorized, we can double the anti-tank capabilities of our artillery?" Gromov was silent. He didn't know what to answer. "Quote 65, said Sokolov. "This evening I'll report to the artillery commander. If everything goes well, by tomorrow your method will become official tactics." He turned and walked to his car, then stopped. "Senior Sergeant," he said, "if you hadn't taken the risk back in June at the training range, we wouldn't have learned about this. Sometimes breaking an order is the only way to win." On the evening of July 12th, when the battle near Prokhorovka subsided, Major Sokolov was reporting at Voronezh Front headquarters. He was heard by the front's artillery commander, Lieutenant General Varentsev, and the Stavka representative, Marshal of Artillery Voronov. The report took 40 minutes. Sokolov presented data on the results of the battles of July 11th and 12th, described Gromov's method, cited statistics. 68 shots without incidents.
Vorentsev listened silently, occasionally making notes in his notebook. Voronov asked questions, short, precise, to the point. "Why did the designers think the shell would explode in the barrel?" asked the marshal.
The fuse cannot withstand the overload with a full charge, Comrade Marshal of Artillery. Muzzle velocity of 680 meters per second is too much. But with a reduced charge, the velocity drops to 400 to 450. That's enough for the fuse to withstand. But accuracy drops. Yes, sir. Effective range no more than 500 meters. But at such a distance, an experienced gunner hits in 80 cases out of 100. Voronov stood up and approached the map. If we authorize the use of shaped charge shells in divisional artillery, how many guns can we equip with this ammunition? Sokolov was ready for this question. In the front's warehouses, there are about 150,000 shaped charge shells of 76 millimeter caliber. Comrade Marshal of Artillery, another million or so throughout the Red Army. If we authorize their use, each divisional gun will receive 15 to 20 shaped charge shells, in addition to the standard ammunition load, and each of these guns will be able to destroy a Tiger. Yes, sir, Comrade Marshal of Artillery. Provided it hits the side or rear at a distance of up to 500 meters. Voronov turned to Vorentsev. Your opinion, Comrade General? Vorentsev stood up. Comrade Marshal of Artillery, the method is risky. We haven't conducted full-scale tests. 68 shots is insufficient statistics. The fuse could fail at any moment. But today our artillerymen destroyed 23 German tanks using this method, Voronov noted. And how many did they destroy with standard armor-piercing rounds? Vorentsev paused. Fewer, Comrade Marshal of Artillery. Significantly fewer. Then what choice do we have? Continue losing men and guns or take the risk? The general didn't answer. No answer was required. Voronov returned to the table and picked up the telephone receiver. Connect me with Stavka, with Comrade Stalin. The conversation with the Supreme Commander-in-Chief lasted 15 minutes. Gromov never learned the details of this conversation, but he learned the result. On July 13, 1943, at 6 o'clock in the morning, an encrypted telegram arrived at all artillery units of the Voronezh and Central fronts. Urgent, secret, to artillery unit commanders. As a combat trial, the use of BP 350 M-shaped charge shells in ZIS-3 and F-34 divisional guns is authorized under the following conditions. First, use only reduced charge, casing 54 G354A or equivalent. Second, firing distance no more than 500 meters. Third, target, side and rear projection of enemy armored vehicles. Fourth, gun crew personnel must be familiarized with the possible risk of premature fuse detonation. Commander of Red Army Artillery, Marshal of Artillery Voronov. Gromov's method became official tactics. In the following days of the Battle of Kursk, shaped charge shells were used more and more actively. Artillerymen learned the new tactics. Let tanks approach close range, hit the side and rear, change position after each shot. Losses remained high. Combat at a distance of 500 meters with a German tank is always a risk. But now artillerymen could at least inflict damage on the enemy before dying. The statistics spoke for themselves. Before the introduction of Gromov's method, the loss ratio in artillery battles against German heavy tanks was approximately 5-1. For each destroyed Tiger or Panther, 5 Soviet guns were lost. After the introduction of the method, the ratio changed to 2-1. This wasn't victory, but it was improvement. Every improvement saved lives. On July 15th, Gromov received a summons to division headquarters. He was met by an unfamiliar colonel in artilleryman's uniform. "Senior Sergeant Gromov," asked the colonel. I am the commander of an artillery brigade of the High Command Reserve. I have been tasked with organizing training for artillerymen in the new method of fighting heavy tanks. Your method. Gromov didn't know what to say. You will be an instructor, the colonel continued. Temporarily detached from your regiment to a training center. Term, 2 weeks. During this time, you must train at least 50 gun crew commanders. And my crew, Comrade Colonel? Your crew will fight without you. War doesn't wait. Gromov spent the next 2 weeks in the rear at a training center near Voronezh. He told and showed how to load, how to aim, how to choose a target, how to determine the moment to fire. The artillerymen listened attentively. Many of them had lost comrades in battles with German tanks. They knew what an invulnerable tiger meant, and they wanted to learn how to destroy it. By the end of July 1943, Gromov's method was being used on all sectors of the Kursk salient. The Germans noticed the changes. Their tankers became more cautious, tried not to show their sides to Soviet guns. But in maneuverable combat, avoiding this is impossible. On July 23rd, Soviet forces went on the counteroffensive. The Battle of Kursk entered its final phase. The Germans were retreating. On July 27th, Gromov returned to his regiment. His crew had suffered losses. The gunner was killed. The shell carrier was seriously wounded. But the gun was intact, and the battery continued to fight. Gromov again took the position of crew commander. He was no longer just a senior sergeant. His name was known throughout the army. But for him, nothing had changed. He still fired at German tanks, still risked his life, still lost comrades. The war continued. On August 5, 1943, Soviet forces liberated Oryol. The next day, Belgorod. In Moscow, for the first time during the war, an artillery salute thundered in honor of the victors. Gromov didn't hear that salute. He was at the front near Kharkov, preparing for the next battle. But that day he was awarded the Order of the Red Star for distinction in battles near Prokhorovka. The award citation read, quote, 68, quote. Gromov looked at the order and put it in his tunic pocket. The award was pleasant, but it didn't bring back dead comrades. It didn't end the war. And the war was still far from over. The autumn of 1943 brought new battles and new losses. The Red Army was advancing along the entire front, liberating Ukraine, forcing the Dnieper, breaking through to the borders of Belarus. And everywhere, on every sector of the front, artillerymen applied Gromov's method. Gromov himself continued to fight as part of his regiment. After the Battle of Kursk, the regiment participated in the liberation of Kharkov, then in the battle for the Dnieper. Gromov forced the Great River in October 43, transporting the gun on a raft under German fire. Half the crew died during the crossing, but the gun reached the western bank. On the bridgehead beyond the Dnieper, Gromov again used his method. The Germans threw the Viking tank division into a counterattack, an elite SS formation equipped with Panthers and Tigers. The fighting continued for 3 days without a break. On October 17th, on the third day of fighting, Gromov destroyed his 30th tank. It was a Panther trying to break through to the division command post. Gromov let it approach to 300 meters and drove a shaped charge shell into the side of the turret. The tank caught fire instantly. The shaped charge jet ignited the ammunition rack. After this battle, a war correspondent from the army newspaper approached Gromov. A young lieutenant with a notebook and pencil in a brand new tunic that hadn't yet faded from the sun and become saturated with powder smoke. Senior Sergeant Gromov, the same one who came up with firing shaped charge rounds from the ZIS-3. Gromov looked at him with tired eyes. Didn't come up with it, just tried it. But it was forbidden. The shell could explode in the barrel. Could have, Gromov agreed. But a German shell could explode outside. The difference is small.
The correspondent wrote down every word. "Tell me, how did you think of this?"
Gromov paused, remembering. The night before the battle near Prokhorovka, the crate of shells he dragged through the forest under flare rockets. Calculations in his head: muzzle velocity, overload, armor thickness. "I worked at a factory before the war," he said finally. "Repaired locomotives. There I learned to think about what metal can withstand and what it can't. In war, it came in handy." "And were you scared when you loaded the forbidden shell for the first time?" Gromov grinned. "I was scared every day, every battle. Scared to watch your comrades die and you can't do anything. That's scary. And pressing the trigger, that's just work." The article came out a week later in the newspaper Red Star. It was called Master of Direct Fire. Gromov never read it. By that time, he was already in the hospital with a shrapnel wound to his leg. The wound turned out to be serious. The fragment broke the shin bone, and doctors spent several days deciding whether to amputate the leg or try to save it. In the end, they decided to save it. Gromov spent 3 months in the hospital, November, December, and January. He lay on his cot, looked at the ceiling, and listened to Sovinformbureau reports on the hospital radio. The Red Army was advancing, liberating city after city, and he lay here helpless and couldn't help in any way. In December, Lieutenant Colonel Ermakov visited him. The regimental commander came to the hospital specifically to see Gromov. He asked, sitting on a stool by the bed. "Good." Ermakov paused. "I brought you something." He took several sheets of paper from his map case. Gromov took them and began to read. These were excerpts from combat reports from different units: 5th Guards Tank Army, 13th Army, 60th Army. Everywhere the same thing. The use of shaped charge shells by Senior Sergeant Gromov's method allowed the destruction of enemy tanks. The numbers added up to hundreds, then thousands. "Over the last 4 months," said Ermakov, "more than 2,000 German tanks and self-propelled guns have been destroyed using your method. This is official statistics, confirmed by inspection reports." Gromov looked at the numbers and couldn't believe it. 2,000. 2,347 to be exact. Ermakov took out another document. And here it was, an order awarding Gromov the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, signed by the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR on December 22, 1943. Gromov looked at the document for a long time. The Gold Star of a Hero, the country's highest award, for breaking an order and risking his life. "Congratulations, Alexei Pavlovich," said Ermakov. "You earned it." Gromov didn't know what to say. He thought about those who didn't live to see this day. About Sidorenko, who died near Kharkov a week after Prokhorovka. About Morozov, who burned at his gun on the Dnieper. About hundreds of other artillerymen who applied his method and died trying to let German tanks approach to firing distance. "Comrade Lieutenant Colonel," he said finally, "this isn't my achievement. This is the achievement of everyone who fired these shells." Ermakov nodded. "I know, but someone had to start, and that someone was you." In February 1944, Gromov returned to duty. His leg still hurt and he limped slightly, but the doctors declared him fit for service. He was appointed battery commander in a new anti-tank destroyer regiment. Now he had 4 guns instead of 1 and 60 people under his command for whom he was responsible. His first battle in the new position occurred in March near Ternopil. The Germans were attempting to break through to the encircled garrison and threw a tank group into the attack. About 40 vehicles, including 10 Tigers. Gromov positioned his battery on a commanding height that blocked the road to the city. The guns were dug in, camouflaged, and zeroed in.
Each crew had 20 cumulative shells in addition to the standard ammunition load. He gathered the gun commanders before the battle. "Understand the main thing," he said. "Never shoot head-on. Wait until the tank shows its side or rear. Let them approach to 400 meters, and after every 2 or 3 shots, change position." "What if a tank is coming straight at us?" asked one of the commanders, a young sergeant who had recently arrived from the training regiment. "Then leave. It's better to lose a position than a gun. A gun can be restored. People cannot." The battle began at 7 in the morning. German tanks advanced in a broad front, trying to envelop the height from the flanks. Gromov waited until they approached. 800 meters. 700. 600.
One of the guns couldn't hold out and opened fire with armor-piercing shells. The shells bounced off the frontal armor of the Tigers. Gromov cursed. 500 meters. The Tigers began maneuvering, bypassing the height. Their sides opened up. 4 guns fired almost simultaneously. 3 hits. 2 Tigers caught fire. 1 stopped with a broken track. The battery worked like a single mechanism. Guns fired, moved, fired again. German tanks burned one after another. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the battle was over. Of the 40 German vehicles, 23 remained on the battlefield, knocked out or destroyed. Gromov's battery lost 1 gun and 6 men. 2 killed, 4 wounded. This was a ratio that previously could only be dreamed of. The spring and summer of 1944 became a time of great offensives. Operation Bagration destroyed the German Army Group Center. The Red Army liberated Belorussia, entered Poland, and approached the borders of Germany. Gromov went through all of this. His battery participated in the liberation of Minsk, Vilnius, and Kaunas. Each city meant new battles, new losses, new victories. By autumn of 1944, Gromov's method was fully integrated into Soviet military doctrine. Cumulative shells became standard ammunition for all types of artillery guns, not only regimental, but also divisional and even tank guns. The designers finally refined the fuse, making it safe under any charges. But this did not happen by itself. It happened because thousands of artillerymen risked using unfinished shells in battle. Many of them died. Many were wounded. But their experience formed the basis of new tactics and new technology. In October 1944, Gromov was summoned to Moscow. He was received by the Deputy Commander of Artillery of the Red Army, Colonel General Chestyakov. "Captain Gromov," said the general. By that time, Gromov had already received his officer's rank. Gromov did not understand. Chestyakov stood up and approached the window. He turned to Gromov. Gromov wanted to object. He was a combat officer, not a scientist. His place was at the front, at the gun. But the general did not let him speak. Gromov spent the next 3 months at a research institute near Moscow, working with designers and engineers. He told them about combat experience, about how cumulative shells behaved in real conditions, which targets they hit better, which worse. The result of this work was several improvements in shell design. A new fuse that was completely safe under any overloads, an improved shape of the cumulative cavity that increased armor penetration by 15%, a new copper lining that produced a more stable cumulative jet. These improvements went into production at the beginning of 1945. By the assault on Berlin, Soviet artillery was armed with a new generation of cumulative shells. In February 1945, Gromov returned to the front. He was appointed commander of an anti-tank destroyer division. 12 guns, almost 200 personnel. The division participated in the Vistula-Oder operation, in battles for Poznan and Kustrin. German resistance was desperate but meaningless. The Red Army was moving inexorably toward Berlin. On the 16th of April, the Berlin operation began. Gromov's division was attached to the 3rd Shock Army, advancing on the northern flank. The battles for Berlin were unlike anything Gromov had encountered before. The city had turned into a fortress. Every house was a firing point, every intersection a barricade. German tanks and self-propelled guns hid in ruins, appearing suddenly and disappearing just as quickly. Cumulative shells were indispensable in these conditions. Combat took place at short distances, 50, 100, 200 meters. The armor of German vehicles did not matter. At such distances, a cumulative shell could penetrate anything. On the 25th of April, Gromov's division fought in the Moabit district. The Germans had taken up positions in a prison building, a massive brick structure with thick walls. In the prison basement sheltered 2 King Tigers, the newest German heavy tanks with frontal armor of 180 millimeters. King Tigers were invulnerable to any Soviet gun in a frontal attack. Even cumulative shells could not penetrate their frontal armor. But Gromov knew what to do. He ordered 2 guns to advance to side streets, blocking possible retreat routes for the German tanks. Then he organized a false infantry attack on the prison's front gates. The German tank crews took the bait. The King Tigers crawled out of cover to shoot at the attacking infantry. They did not notice Gromov's gun, hiding in the ruins of neighboring houses. 2 shots, 2 hits to the side. Both King Tigers caught fire. These were the last tanks destroyed by Gromov in that war. On the 30th of April, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in a bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. On the 2nd of May, the Berlin garrison capitulated. On the 8th of May, Germany signed the Act of Unconditional Surrender. The war was over. Gromov received news of victory on a street in destroyed Berlin. His division was resting near the Brandenburg Gate, or rather what remained of it. The triumphal arch was riddled with bullets and shrapnel. The chariot at the top was destroyed by a direct hit. All around, people were celebrating. Soldiers fired into the air, embraced, cried. Someone sang, someone danced. Someone just sat and was silent, not believing it was all over. Gromov sat on the steps of a destroyed house and looked at the sky. It was gray with smoke, but through the smoke, the sun broke through. The first peaceful sun in 4 years. He thought about those who had not lived to see this day, about Sidorenko, Morozov, Chernik, about hundreds of artillerymen from his regiment who had died from 1941 to 1945, about thousands of soldiers he had seen dead on battlefields. He thought about whether it was worth it, whether 2,347 destroyed tanks were worth the lives that were given for this victory. There was no answer. Perhaps there could not be one. His orderly approached him, a young private Razrezani, similar to the late Semyon Prokhorov. Gromov stood up and went to the field telephone. The war was over, but service continued, and one had to live on with this victory and with this memory. Gromov was not demobilized immediately. He remained in the army until autumn 1946, first in occupation forces in Germany, then at a training center near Moscow, where he trained young artillerymen. He was often asked to tell the story of the battles near Prokhorovka, about how he violated orders and used forbidden shells, 14 tanks in 20 minutes. Gromov told it, but without pride. For him, it was simply part of the war, terrible, bloody, necessary. He did what he had to do, like millions of others. In autumn 1946, he returned home to Barabinsk. The city had hardly changed. The same wooden houses, the same railway station, the same factory where he had worked before the war. Only there were fewer people. Many had not returned. Gromov got a job at the factory again, now not as a foreman, but as head of the repair shop. The work was familiar. His hands remembered every movement.
But sometimes at night he dreamed of tanks, tigers, panthers, king tigers. They came at him from the darkness, and he would wake in a cold sweat,
reaching for the non-existent trigger of a gun. In 1948, he married. His wife's name was Maria. She worked as a teacher at the local school. They met at a factory celebration in honor of Victory Day. Maria knew nothing about the war. She had spent it in evacuation in Central Asia. But she understood that Gromov had been through something terrible and did not ask unnecessary questions. In 1950, their son was born. They named him Pavel, in honor of Gromov's father, who had died in besieged Leningrad in the winter of 1942. Life was entering a peaceful routine. Gromov worked, raised his son, repaired locomotives. The war was receding into the past, becoming a memory, history. But sometimes the past reminded him of itself. In 1953, a journalist from Moscow tracked down Gromov. He was writing a book about the Battle of Kursk and wanted to include the story of the cumulative firing method. Gromov refused for a long time. He did not like to remember the war, did not like to talk about it. But the journalist was persistent. He said, in the end, Gromov agreed. He told everything, from the night before the battle when he dragged a crate of shells across the field under flares to the last battles in Berlin. The journalist recorded for hours, asking clarifying questions, demanding details. The book came out in 1954. It was called The Fiery Ark. The chapter about Gromov occupied 30 pages. The author called it, after the book's publication, Gromov began to be invited to meetings with youth, to school lessons in courage, to factory gatherings. He went rarely. He did not like publicity, did not like being the center of attention, but sometimes he agreed. At one such meeting in 1956, an old man in a shabby jacket with metal bars approached him. Gromov did not recognize him immediately. Time changes people. Don't you recognize me, Lyosha? Gromov peered at the old man's face and recognized him. It was Nikolai Stepanovich Ermakov, the former regimental commander, the very one who had covered for Gromov after the first battle near Prokhorovka, who had not sent him to a tribunal for violating orders. They embraced, two old soldiers who had been through hell and survived. Said Ermakov. Replied Gromov. Ermakov smiled. They talked until evening, remembering fallen comrades, battles, victories, and defeats. They remembered that day near Prokhorovka when 14 tanks burned on the field and Gromov sat by the destroyed gun, not yet understanding that he had changed the course of the war. Said Ermakov before parting. Gromov shook his head. Gromov did not argue. Perhaps Ermakov was right, or perhaps not. It no longer mattered. The war was over. The people who won it were gradually passing away. Only memory remained. In the 1960s, Gromov became director of the Barabinsk locomotive repair factory. By that time, steam locomotives were already giving way to diesel locomotives, and the factory was switching to new technology. Gromov led this transition, just as he had once led the artillery's transition to cumulative shells. The parallels were obvious. Then and now it was necessary to break established habits, teach people something new, overcome the resistance of those who did not want to change. Nothing changes, he told his wife. It was the same in the war. People are afraid of the new, afraid to take risks, prefer to do what doesn't work rather than try what might work. Maria smiled and poured him tea. She had long grown accustomed to the fact that her husband saw war in everything. In work, in life, in relationships between people. You won then, she said. You'll win now too. And he did win. The factory switched to repairing diesel locomotives, mastered new technologies, reached a new level. Gromov received the Order of the Red Banner of Labor,
the second highest award in his life after the Gold Star of Hero. In 1973, for the 30th anniversary of the Battle of Kursk, Gromov was invited to Prokhorovka Field. They were opening a memorial complex there, a monument to those who fought and died in the greatest tank battle in history. Gromov came with his son, who by that time was 23 years old. Pavel worked as an engineer at the same factory where his father had once worked. He grew up on stories about the war, but had never seen the place where his father became a hero.
They stood on height 232.5, the very one where Gromov had fought his first battle with cumulative shells. The hill was covered with grass, and nothing reminded one that tanks had once burned here and people had died.
"Here?" asked Pavel.
"Here," Gromov nodded. "Over there stood my gun. From there came the tanks, Tigers in front, Panthers behind them."
He pointed, explained, remembered. 30 years had passed, but he remembered every detail. He remembered how his hands trembled when he loaded the first cumulative shell. He remembered how the Tiger stopped after a hit to the turret. He remembered how Morozov shouted when he realized the method worked.
"You know, son," said Gromov, "war is not what they show in films. It's not feats and not awards. It's fear. Constant, continuous fear. And the only thing that helps overcome it is doing your work. Simply doing your work, no matter what."
Pavel looked at his father and saw an old man with gray hair and a face lined with wrinkles. A person who went through hell and came back. A person who learned not to be afraid, or at least not to show fear. "I am proud of you, Dad," he said. Gromov embraced his son. "The main thing is that you don't have to go through what we went through. The main thing is to have a peaceful life." Alexei Pavlovich Gromov died on the 12th of July, 1988, exactly 45 years after the main battle near Prokhorovka. He was 71 years old. He outlived his wife by 3 years.
He spent his last months in his son's house in Novosibirsk, surrounded by grandchildren. Until his last day, he maintained a clear mind and firm memory. A few days before his death, he asked his son to bring him an old box that he had kept for many years. In the box lay awards: the Gold Star of a Hero, the Order of the Red Star, the Order of the Red Banner of Labor, medals, and also an empty shell casing from a shaped charge projectile. The very one he had picked up after the battle on the 11th of July, 1943. He said, holding the casing in his hands. He was buried in Barabinsk at the city cemetery next to his wife. A simple monument was erected on the grave, a granite slab with his name, dates, and an inscription: Hero of the Soviet Union, Artilleryman. The story of Alexei Gromov did not end with his death. His method of using shaped charge projectiles in divisional artillery entered military textbooks. His experience was studied in military academies of the Soviet Union and later in Russia. But Gromov's main legacy is not in textbooks or tactical techniques. The main legacy is in that simple truth which he proved with his life. Sometimes rules need to be broken. Sometimes the only way to win is to risk everything. Sometimes one person standing at a gun sees what generals and designers do not see. Gromov was not a genius. He was not a scientist or inventor. He was a simple artilleryman, a mechanic from a locomotive repair plant, a person who knew how to fix machines and think with his own head. But it was he, not professors in Moscow laboratories, who understood that shaped charge projectiles could be used in divisional guns. It was he who risked testing his theory in battle. It was he who gave the Red Army a weapon against invulnerable Tigers. 2,347 tanks. That is how many German machines were destroyed by Gromov's method during the Great Patriotic War. Each of these tanks could have killed dozens of Soviet soldiers. Each destroyed tank meant saved lives. If we count at a minimum of 10 lives per tank, Gromov's method saved more than 20,000 people. 20,000 soldiers who returned home, started families, raised children. This is the real legacy. Not orders, not honors, not monuments. People. Living people who exist because one artilleryman in July of 1943 decided to disobey an order. In 2015, for the 70th anniversary of victory, a memorial sign was erected on Prokhorovka Field, a small stele with an inscription. On this spot on the 11th of July, 1943, Senior Sergeant A.P. Gromov used shape-charge projectiles in divisional artillery, destroying 14 enemy tanks. His method was spread throughout the entire Red Army. Next to the stele stands a 76mm Zis-3 gun, the same kind from which Gromov fired. The gun is turned toward the direction from which German tanks once came. Every year, on the 12th of July, people come here. Veterans, those who are still alive, very few remain. Their children and grandchildren, school children with teachers, tourists from different cities of Russia. They stand at the monument and listen to the guide's story about how one person dared to do the impossible, about how disobeying an order became salvation, about how engineering thought defeated German armor. And every time this story sounds over Prokhorovka Field, the memory of Senior Sergeant Gromov comes alive again. The memory of a person who was not afraid to take a risk, who did what was considered impossible, who won. On the desk of Gromov's grandson, Andrei Pavlovich, stands an old photograph. In it is a young man in military uniform with an order on his chest. His face is tanned, his eyes are squinting as if peering into the horizon. This is Alexei Gromov in 1944, right after being awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. Next to the photograph is that very shell casing, the empty brass casing from a shaped charge projectile that his grandfather kept all his life. Andrei works as an engineer at a defense enterprise in Novosibirsk. He designs modern ammunition, including shaped charge projectiles. Technology has gone far ahead. Today's projectiles penetrate armor that designers of the 1940s could not have dreamed of. But the principle remains the same. Directed explosion, shaped charge jet, armor penetration. The same principle that his grandfather used in July of 1943. Sometimes, when Andrei works on another project and encounters a problem that seems unsolvable, he looks at his grandfather's photograph and thinks, what would he have done? And every time, the answer is the same. He would have taken a risk. He would have tried. He would have found a way. Because sometimes, the only path to victory is to do what is considered impossible.